Sarah Martinez had always believed that life couldn't get much worse than sleeping in her car behind a gas station in Phoenix, Arizona. At 28 years old, she carried the weight of 1,000 broken promises and shattered dreams. Her once bright eyes, which used to sparkle with hope and determination, now reflected nothing but emptiness and defeat. The summer heat was unbearable, even at night. Sarah would crack the windows of her beat-up Honda Civic just enough to let some air in, but not enough to invite unwanted visitors. She had learned to sleep with one eye open after 3 months of homelessness. The city that had once promised her a fresh start had become her prison. She hadn't always been this way. Just 2 years ago, Sarah was a promising nursing student at Arizona State University. She had dreams of helping people, of making a difference in the world. Her professors praised her dedication, and her classmates admired her determination to succeed despite coming from a broken home. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. The downward spiral began when her mother was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Sarah dropped out of school to care for her, using her student loan money and part-time job earnings to pay for treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. She watched helplessly as her mother fought bravely for 8 months before losing the battle. The medical bills that followed were astronomical, and with no family support and mounting debt, Sarah found herself evicted from her apartment. What started as a temporary setback became a permanent nightmare. Without a degree, finding decent work proved impossible. She bounced from one minimum wage job to another, never earning enough to afford rent in a city where housing costs seemed to climb daily. Eventually, she lost even those jobs when she had no permanent address to provide employers. The streets of Phoenix were unforgiving. Sarah quickly learned that being homeless and female made her a target. She had to stay alert constantly, moving from place to place to avoid the predators who lurked in the shadows. The gas station where she now parked had become her safest refuge because the night clerk, an elderly man named Miguel, would occasionally let her use the restroom and fill up her water bottle. Drug dealers frequented the area, and they had noticed the desperate young woman who lived in her car. They started with small offers, a few dollars for holding packages, then gradually bigger sums for more dangerous tasks. Sarah had resisted so far, but hunger and desperation were wearing down her resolve. She could feel herself getting closer to crossing lines she had sworn she would never cross. Her phone had been disconnected months ago, cutting off her last connection to the outside world. She had sold most of her belongings just to buy gas and the occasional meal. The wedding ring from her brief marriage, a relationship that had crumbled under the pressure of her mother's illness and mounting debt, was the last valuable thing she owned. She stared at it sometimes, remembering the woman she used to be. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. Days would pass without meaningful human contact. Miguel would nod and say hello, but their language barrier prevented deeper conversation. The other homeless individuals she encountered were often too consumed by their own struggles to offer companionship. Sarah felt invisible, as if she had disappeared from the world entirely. She had tried calling old friends, but most had moved on with their lives. They offered sympathy but little concrete help. Some suggested she contact social services, but Sarah had already spent countless hours in waiting rooms and on phone calls, only to be told about waiting lists and programs with no available spots. The system that was supposed to help people like her seemed designed to frustrate them instead. Sleep became her escape, though even that was fitful and interrupted. She would dream of her old life, studying for exams, laughing with classmates, caring for patients during her clinical rotations. Sometimes she dreamed of her mother, healthy and proud of her daughter's achievements. These dreams made waking up to reality even more painful. The heat was getting worse as summer progressed, and Sarah knew her car wouldn't be a viable shelter much longer. The engine was already showing signs of strain from being her full-time home. Without air conditioning and with windows that barely opened, the metal vehicle became an oven during the day. She had started spending daylight hours in the library or mall, pretending to browse while actually seeking refuge from the temperature. Her health was declining too. Poor nutrition, lack of proper hygiene facilities, and constant stress were taking their toll. She had lost significant weight and her clothes hung loosely on her shrinking frame. Sometimes she caught glimpses of herself in store windows and barely recognized the gaunt face staring back. The drug dealers were getting more persistent. They knew desperation when they saw it, and Sarah's was becoming harder to hide. They would approach her car with friendly smiles and promises of easy money. Their offers were starting to sound less like temptation and more like salvation. Sarah found herself calculating how much one small job might earn her. Enough for a motel room, a real shower, a decent meal. She still carried a photo of herself in her nursing school uniform, taken during her graduation ceremony from the preparatory program. In it, she was smiling broadly, surrounded by classmates full of hope for the future. Now that photo felt like it belonged to someone else entirely, someone who had believed that hard work and good intentions were enough to succeed in life. As Sarah sat in her car that particular evening, watching the sun set over the mountains surrounding Phoenix, she felt something inside her begin to break. The last threads of hope that had kept her going were starting to fray. She closed her eyes and wondered how much longer she could continue, fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win. The sound of children playing in a nearby apartment complex reminded her of dreams she once had of having a family of her own. Those dreams felt like cruel jokes now. How could someone who couldn't even take care of herself ever hope to care for others? The woman who had once wanted to heal people couldn't even heal her own broken life. Tomorrow would bring another day of survival, another day of trying to remain invisible while searching for scraps of hope in a world that seemed determined to forget she existed. The morning Sarah's life changed forever started like any other. She woke up cramped and sweaty in the back seat of her Honda, her neck stiff from sleeping at an awkward angle. The Arizona sun was already blazing even though it was barely 7 in the morning. She had learned to wake early to avoid the worst of the heat that would turn her car into a furnace by noon. Miguel was ending his night shift at the gas station, and he gave her his usual sympathetic nod as she stumbled out of her car to use the restroom. Her reflection in the cracked mirror was a shock. Her once glossy black hair was matted and unwashed. Her skin had a grayish pallor, and her clothes were wrinkled and stained. She splashed cold water on her face and tried to make herself presentable, though she wasn't sure why she bothered anymore. When she emerged from the restroom, a man was standing near her car. Sarah's heart immediately started racing. Strangers approaching her car usually meant trouble. But this man was different from the usual threats she faced. He was tall and lean, with weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. His long black hair was pulled back in a traditional braid, and he wore simple jeans and a button-down shirt. What struck her most were his eyes, dark and serious but not threatening. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. "Are you all right?" The question caught Sarah off guard. It had been months since anyone had asked about her well-being with genuine concern. She instinctively took a step back, her defenses rising. "I'm fine," she lied, the words coming out more harshly than she intended. The man studied her for a moment, his expression unchanging. "My name is Joseph Crow Feather," he said. "I couldn't help but notice you've been staying here for several weeks now." Sarah felt a flush of shame and panic. Had someone called the police? Was she about to be arrested or forced to move on again? "I'm not causing any trouble," she said quickly. "I'll leave if—" "That's not why I'm here," Joseph interrupted gently. "I work at the community center about 10 minutes from here. We have resources for people who need help." "I don't need charity," Sarah snapped. Though even as she said it, she knew how ridiculous it sounded. She was living in her car, wearing the same clothes for days at a time and hadn't had a proper meal in 48 hours. Of course she needed help. Joseph didn't argue with her or point out the obvious. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "If you change your mind," he said, setting it on the roof of her car. "We're open every day." After he left, Sarah stared at the card for a long time before finally picking it up. Desert Springs Community Center, it read. Joseph Crow Feather, Outreach Coordinator. There was an address and phone number, but what caught her attention was a small logo in the corner. It looked like a traditional Native American design. For 3 more days, Sarah carried the card in her pocket without doing anything about it. Pride and fear warred within her. Pride told her she could still figure things out on her own, that accepting help would mean admitting complete failure. Fear whispered that getting involved with strangers could make her situation worse, that she was safer staying invisible. The decision was made for her on a Thursday evening when 2 men approached her car while she was trying to sleep. They weren't the usual drug dealers who had been pressuring her. These men were different, meaner, more aggressive. They wanted her to move locations for reasons they wouldn't explain. And when she refused, one of them grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises. "Listen, lady," the larger man snarled, "you can't just set up camp wherever you want. This is our territory now and you're bad for business. Sarah tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. I'm not bothering anyone, she protested, hating how small and frightened her voice sounded. You're bothering us, the second man said. Find somewhere else to park your little home or we'll find it for you. They eventually left, but not before making it clear that this wasn't a request. Sarah sat in her car shaking, knowing she couldn't spend another night in this location. But she also knew that finding another safe place to park was becoming increasingly difficult. The police had already moved her from several locations, and other areas were controlled by people who made tonight's visitors look friendly. The next morning, Sarah found herself standing outside the Desert Springs Community Center, Joseph's business card clutched in her sweaty palm. The building was modest but well-maintained, with desert landscaping and a mural depicting various scenes of southwestern life. Through the windows, she could see people moving around inside, some in business attire, others who looked like they might be in situations similar to her own. She stood there for 20 minutes, paralyzed by indecision. Several times she turned to leave, only to stop and turn back. Finally, a woman emerged from the building and approached her with a warm smile. Are you here to see someone? The woman asked kindly. She appeared to be in her 50s, with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes. I have this card, Sarah stammered, holding it up. Joseph Crowfeather gave it to me. Oh, Joseph. He's wonderful. I'm Linda, the volunteer coordinator. Come on in. I'll get him for you. The interior of the community center was surprisingly busy. There were people of all ages engaged in various activities, some working on computers, others sitting in small groups talking, children playing in a supervised area. It felt warm and welcoming in a way that made Sarah's chest tighten with emotion. She thought she had lost the ability to feel. Joseph appeared a few minutes later, and his face lit up with genuine pleasure when he saw her. I'm glad you came, he said simply. Would you like to sit down and talk? He led her to a small office decorated with Native American artwork and family photos. On his desk was a framed picture of him in military uniform, standing next to what appeared to be his wife and children. Another photo showed him in traditional Native dress at what looked like a cultural ceremony. First things first, Joseph said, settling into his chair. When did you last have a real meal? The question was so direct and practical that Sarah almost smiled despite everything. Yesterday, I think. Or maybe the day before. Okay, let's start there. He picked up his phone and spoke briefly to someone, then hung up. Linda's making you a sandwich and getting some coffee. We can talk while you eat. When Sarah started to protest that she couldn't pay for food, Joseph held up a hand. This isn't about payment. This is about one human being helping another. That's what we do here. As they waited for the food, Joseph began to tell her about the community center. It had been founded 15 years ago to serve the diverse population of this part of Phoenix. Native Americans, Hispanic families, homeless individuals, recent immigrants, and anyone else who needed support. They offered everything from job training and counseling to emergency assistance and childcare. I grew up on the San Carlos Apache reservation, Joseph explained. I know what it's like to feel forgotten by the world, like you don't matter to anyone. After I got out of the Army, I decided I wanted to spend my life making sure other people didn't have to feel that way. When Linda brought the food, Sarah tried to eat slowly and maintain some dignity, but her hunger won out. She devoured the turkey sandwich and soup as if she hadn't seen food in weeks, which wasn't far from the truth. Joseph watched without judgment, occasionally refilling her coffee cup. Now, he said when she had finished eating, tell me about your situation, not what led to it. We can talk about that later if you want to. Just tell me what you need right now to be safe. For the first time in months, Sarah felt safe enough to tell the truth. Sitting in Joseph's office with a full stomach and someone who actually seemed to care about her answer, she found words spilling out of her that she had kept buried for so long. I need somewhere safe to sleep, she began quietly. My car isn't working well anymore, and these men told me I have to move from where I've been staying. I'm scared they'll hurt me if I go back there. Joseph nodded, making notes on a yellow pad. What about during the day? Do you have somewhere to go when it gets too hot? Sometimes the library, or I walk around the mall until security tells me to leave. But mostly I just drive around wasting gas I can't afford looking for shade. Any income at all right now? Sarah shook her head, embarrassed. I lost my last job 6 weeks ago when they found out I was homeless. They said it was for other reasons, but I know why, really. Joseph set down his pen and leaned forward. Sarah, I want to explain how we work here, and then I want to ask you to make a choice. We don't just hand out temporary fixes. We work with people to rebuild their lives from the ground up, but it requires commitment from both sides. He explained that the center had partnerships with several organizations throughout Phoenix. They could provide immediate emergency housing for up to 30 days while working on longer-term solutions. There were job training programs, counseling services, and educational support. Most importantly, there was a community of people who understood what she was going through. But here's what I need from you, Joseph continued. I need you to be honest with me about everything. Your situation, your history, what led you here, and what you want for your future. And I need you to commit to showing up. This isn't going to be easy or quick. Sarah felt a familiar surge of defensive pride. I'm not looking for a handout. I know you're not, Joseph interrupted gently. Pride is important. It's part of what's kept you alive out there. But right now, your pride is also what's keeping you from accepting help that could save your life. He told her about his own experience returning from deployment in Afghanistan. I came back thinking I could handle everything on my own. I had been a warrior, a protector of others. Asking for help felt like admitting I was weak. It took me 2 years of struggling alone before I realized that accepting help didn't make me weak. It made me wise. Joseph opened a desk drawer and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, he extracted what looked like a smooth, dark stone. This is an Apache tear, he said, holding it up so the light from the window made it appear translucent. Legend says they're formed from the tears of Apache women who grieved for warriors lost in battle. But here's what I learned from my grandmother. Tears aren't signs of weakness. They're signs of love, of caring enough to feel pain when something matters. He placed the stone on the desk between them. You've been fighting a war, Sarah. You've been fighting for your survival, your dignity, your life. Warriors need support. They need a tribe. The metaphor resonated with Sarah in a way she hadn't expected. She had been viewing her homelessness as a personal failure, a sign that she wasn't strong enough to handle life's challenges. But Joseph was reframing it as a battle she had been fighting alone, and he was offering her allies. What happens if I say yes? She asked. Joseph smiled for the first time since they had been talking. First, we get you into emergency housing tonight. There's a facility about 15 minutes from here that's clean and safe. Then tomorrow, you meet with our caseworker, Maria, and we start building a plan. He explained that the program was intensive and structured. There would be daily check-ins, job search assistance, counseling sessions to help process the trauma of homelessness, and eventually, help transitioning to permanent housing. The timeline varied for each person, but most people were ready to live independently again within 3 to 6 months. What about my car? Sarah asked. It was old and unreliable, but it was also her only possession of any value. We have a secure lot where you can park it. One of our volunteers is a mechanic. He can take a look at it and see what needs to be fixed. Sarah stared at the Apache tear on the desk, its dark surface reflecting the afternoon light. The idea of sleeping in a real bed, of having access to a shower and clean clothes, was almost overwhelming. But she was also terrified of hoping again. Hope had been what sustained her through her mother's illness and the early days of homelessness, but it had also been what made each disappointment feel like another death. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Good, Joseph said. Fear means you understand that this matters. It means you haven't given up completely. He told her about some of the people who had gone through the program. There was Marcus, who had been homeless for 3 years after losing his job and apartment following a workplace injury. He was now working as a security guard and had his own apartment. There was Carmen, a single mother who had lived in her car with her 2 young children. She had completed a medical assistant training program and was now working at a clinic across town. Not everyone succeeds, Joseph said honestly. Some people aren't ready to do the work it takes. Some people have challenges we're not equipped to handle. But for people who are ready to fight for their lives with support instead of fighting alone, the success rate is pretty good. Sarah picked up the Apache tear and rolled it between her fingers. It was warm and smooth, somehow comforting. What made you become someone who helps people like me? She asked. Joseph was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the desert landscape beyond. When I was deployed, I was part of a unit that provided security for humanitarian aid distribution. I saw what happened to people when their communities broke down, when they lost their support systems and had to survive on their own. I saw how quickly good people could end up in desperate situations through no fault of their own. He turned back to her. But I also saw what happened when people were given real help, not just charity but actual support to rebuild. I saw how strong humans can be when they're not fighting alone. When I came home, I knew I wanted to be part of that kind of healing. The afternoon was getting late, and Sarah realized she had been in the community center for several hours. For the first time in months, she had lost track of time in a way that wasn't about survival or fear. She had been engaged in conversation, thinking about possibilities instead of just trying to make it through another day. "If I do this," she said slowly, "if I accept your help, what do you need from me right now?" Joseph opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder of paperwork. "I need you to fill out some forms so we can get you checked into housing tonight. Then I need you to promise me you'll show up tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock to meet with Maria. After that, we'll take it one day at a time." Sarah took the papers and the pen he offered her. Her hand shook slightly as she wrote her name on the first form, the first official document she had filled out in months that wasn't a job application destined for rejection. As she worked through the paperwork, answering questions about her background and current situation, she felt something shifting inside her. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet. It was more like the possibility of hope, the first crack in the wall she had built around her heart to protect it from more disappointment. For the first time since her mother died, Sarah allowed herself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, there was a way back from the edge where she had been living. The emergency housing facility was nothing like what Sarah had expected. Instead of the institutional building she had imagined, it was a converted apartment complex with individual units for families and shared apartments for single adults. Joseph drove her there in his pickup truck, making casual conversation about the neighborhood while she clutched a small bag containing her few remaining possessions. "This used to be regular low-income housing," he explained as they pulled into the parking lot. "When the owner decided to sell, our organization partnered with the city to purchase it. We've been running it as transitional housing for about 5 years now." The facility manager, a woman named Ruth who appeared to be in her 60s, greeted them at the office. She had kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that immediately put Sarah at ease. "Welcome," she said simply. "Let's get you settled in." Sarah's unit was a studio apartment with a kitchenette, a private bathroom, and a bed with clean sheets. It was basic but clean and safe, with air conditioning that actually worked. After months of living in her car, it felt like luxury. Ruth showed her where the laundry facilities were located and explained the house rules. No alcohol or drugs, quiet hours from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., and mandatory participation in weekly house meetings. "Most people stay here between 3 and 6 months, Ruth explained. "The goal is to give you enough stability to work on the bigger challenges. You'll work with our case management team to address whatever brought you here and develop a plan for permanent housing." After Ruth and Joseph left, Sarah stood alone in her temporary home, overwhelmed by the silence and space. She had grown so accustomed to hypervigilance, to constantly monitoring her surroundings for threats, that the safety felt almost uncomfortable. She walked around the small apartment several times, checking the locks on the door and windows, before finally allowing herself to sit on the bed. The shower was the first real luxury she allowed herself. Standing under hot water with actual shampoo and soap provided by the facility, Sarah watched months of dirt and desperation wash down the drain. She stayed under the spray until her fingers wrinkled, crying tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed during the worst of her ordeal. That night, sleeping in a real bed for the first time in months, Sarah slept for 12 straight hours. She woke up disoriented, having forgotten where she was, then remembered with a jolt of something that might have been relief. Outside her window, she could see other residents of the facility going about their morning routines, walking to the laundry room, heading out to jobs or appointments, supervising children playing in the small courtyard. At 9 o'clock sharp, she was back at the community center to meet with Maria, the caseworker Joseph had mentioned. Maria was a bilingual social worker in her 40s, who had been with the program for 8 years. Her office was decorated with success stories, photos of former clients at graduations, job sites, and new apartments. "Joseph told me a little about your situation," Maria began, "but I'd like to hear your story in your own words. Not just the recent stuff, but how you got to where you are now." For the next 2 hours, Sarah found herself telling her life story to someone who listened without judgment. She talked about growing up in foster care after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. She described her determination to create a better life through education, her excitement about nursing school, and the devastating impact of her mother's illness. "You said your mother," Maria noted, "but earlier you mentioned foster care." Sarah explained that her foster mother, Elena Martinez, had been the one stable figure in her teenage years. "She wasn't required to keep me after I aged out of the system, but she did. She helped me apply for college, co-signed my student loans, let me live with her while I went to school. When she got sick, there was no question that I would take care of her the same way she took care of me." Maria nodded approvingly. "That tells me a lot about your character. You're someone who honors commitments and takes care of people you love. Those are strengths we can build on." The assessment process was thorough but not intrusive. Maria asked about her education, work history, and skills. She inquired about mental health and substance use, explaining that they had resources for both if needed. She wanted to know about Sarah's goals and what kind of life she wanted to rebuild. "I want to finish nursing school," Sarah said, without hesitation. "I want to help people the way Joseph and you are helping me. I want to have a stable life where I'm not afraid all the time." Maria smiled. "Those are good goals. Very achievable with the right support and planning. Let's talk about the steps to get there." The action plan they developed together was both comprehensive and overwhelming. Sarah would meet with Maria twice a week to work on immediate needs and long-term planning. She would participate in job readiness workshops and begin applying for part-time work while focusing on her recovery from the trauma of homelessness. They would work on rebuilding her credit, saving money, and eventually transitioning to permanent housing. "The nursing school goal is absolutely realistic," Maria assured her. "We've had several clients successfully return to college. There are programs specifically designed to help people in your situation complete their education. But first, Sarah needed to focus on healing." Maria explained that homelessness was a form of trauma that affected people in ways they often didn't recognize. The constant stress, hypervigilance, and dehumanization left psychological scars that needed attention. "You've been in survival mode for months," Maria said. "Your body and mind have been focused on just getting through each day. Now that you're safe, you might find yourself feeling things you couldn't afford to feel before." Sarah was skeptical about counseling at first. She had always prided herself on being strong and self-reliant. But Maria explained it differently than Sarah had expected. "This isn't about being weak or broken," Maria said. "It's about learning tools to help you process what you've been through and build resilience for the future. Think of it as physical therapy for your emotional health." The counselor, Dr. Amanda Torres, was a trauma specialist who worked with homeless individuals and veterans. Her approach was practical rather than abstract, focusing on concrete skills Sarah could use to manage anxiety, rebuild self-esteem, and develop healthy coping mechanisms. "Your instincts for survival served you well on the streets," Dr. Torres explained during their first session. "But some of those same instincts might work against you now that you're in recovery. We're going to help you recognize when you're reacting from a place of trauma versus responding from a place of choice." Meanwhile, Sarah began participating in the community center's job readiness program. The instructor, a former corporate recruiter named David, helped participants update their resumes, practice interview skills, and identify employment opportunities that matched their skills and goals. "You have more marketable skills than you realize," David told Sarah after reviewing her background. "Your nursing school experience, even though you didn't complete the program, demonstrates medical knowledge. Your caregiving experience with your foster mother shows responsibility and compassion. We just need to present these experiences in a way that appeals to employers." The job search process was discouraging at first. Many employers were hesitant to hire someone with a gap in employment and no permanent address. But the community center's partnership with local businesses made a difference. They had relationships with employers who were willing to give people second chances, and they provided ongoing support to ensure success. After 3 weeks of applications and interviews, Sarah was offered a part-time position at a medical clinic as a patient services representative. The pay wasn't high, but it was steady income, and the work environment would keep her connected to the healthcare field she hoped to rejoin as a nurse. "This is just the beginning," Joseph reminded her on her first day of work. "Every step forward is building toward the bigger goals." Sarah was starting to believe him. For the first time since her mother's death, she was beginning to see a path forward that didn't involve just surviving from day to day. She was beginning to remember who she had been before everything fell apart. And more importantly, she was starting to envision who she might become. Sarah's apartment hunting process was unlike anything she had experienced before. Instead of desperately calling landlords from her car and being turned away because of her situation, she now had stable employment, good references, and the support of the community center's housing specialist, Karen, who had relationships with landlords throughout the city. The apartment they found was a one-bedroom unit in a small complex about 20 minutes from both the clinic and the community center. It wasn't luxurious, but it had everything Sarah needed. A kitchen where she could cook her own meals. A bathroom that was entirely hers, and most importantly, a lease with her name on it that represented her return to independent living. The day she moved in, Joseph, Maria, and several other friends from the community center helped her carry her belongings up to the second floor. Sarah's possessions still fit in just a few boxes and garbage bags, but they included new items that represented her rebuilt life. Professional clothes for work, books she was reading, kitchen supplies, and photographs from her time at the transitional housing facility. "This feels different from when I moved into the emergency housing," Sarah told Joseph, as they took a break from unpacking. "Then it felt temporary, like I was just visiting someone else's life. This feels like I'm actually home." The transition to independent living came with challenges Sarah hadn't anticipated. After months of structured living with built-in community, the solitude of her own apartment sometimes felt overwhelming. She found herself missing the casual interactions with other residents at the transitional facility, the sense of shared purpose and mutual support. "This is completely normal," Dr. Torres assured her when Sarah brought up these feelings. "You've spent months rebuilding your life within a community of people going through similar experiences. Learning to live independently again while maintaining those connections is a skill in itself." Sarah began hosting weekly dinners for other people from the program who had transitioned to independent housing. These gatherings became a way to maintain the supportive community that had been so crucial to her recovery, while also celebrating everyone's progress towards self-sufficiency. At the clinic, Dr. Williams had been true to her word about supporting Sarah's return to education. She connected Sarah with the nursing program at Phoenix Community College, which had a part-time evening program designed for working adults. The admissions counselor was familiar with the clinic and impressed by Dr. Williams's recommendation. "Your work experience at the clinic, combined with your previous nursing coursework, puts you in an excellent position to succeed in our program," the counselor explained. "We also have financial aid specifically available for students in your situation." Starting classes again after everything she had been through felt surreal. Walking into the nursing lab for the first time in over 3 years, Sarah was flooded with memories of her younger self, the eager student who had believed that hard work and good intentions were enough to guarantee success. She wasn't that person anymore, but the older, more experienced version of herself brought different strengths to her studies. Her classmates were a diverse group of adults juggling education with work and family responsibilities. Many had their own stories of setbacks and second chances. Sarah found herself naturally taking on a mentor role with classmates who were struggling, drawing on her experience of overcoming obstacles. "You have this way of helping people see that their current situation isn't permanent," observed her study partner, Marcus, a single father who was changing careers after being laid off from a factory job. "It's like you've lived through proof that things can get better." Sarah's clinical rotations brought her back to the kind of direct patient care that had originally drawn her to nursing. Working with patients in the hospital setting, she found that her experience of vulnerability and recovery gave her a unique ability to connect with people who were scared, confused, or feeling powerless in the medical system. During a rotation in the emergency department, Sarah was assigned to care for a woman who had been brought in after collapsing at a homeless encampment. The patient was defensive and suspicious, refusing to answer questions about her medical history or living situation. "She reminds me of someone," Sarah told the supervising nurse. "Can I try talking to her?" Sarah approached the woman with the same gentle directness that Joseph had used with her. She didn't pretend to understand exactly what the patient was going through, but she shared enough of her own story to establish trust and credibility. Within an hour, the woman was cooperating with treatment and had accepted a referral to social services. That was impressive. The emergency department physician told Sarah later. I've been trying to build rapport with her for 2 hours. How did you get through to her so quickly? I spoke her language, Sarah replied. Not Spanish or English, but the language of someone who's been forgotten by the world and learned not to trust offers of help. This experience led to Sarah being invited to participate in the hospital's community outreach program. She began accompanying medical teams to homeless encampments and shelters, serving as a bridge between healthcare providers and patients who were suspicious of the medical system. The work was emotionally challenging because it brought Sarah face to face with people living in situations she remembered vividly, but it was also deeply meaningful because she could offer something unique, credible hope based on lived experience. I know this is hard to believe right now, she would tell people who reminded her of herself at her lowest point, but there are people who want to help, and there are ways out of this situation. I know because I've been exactly where you are. Joseph began including Sarah in his outreach rounds, valuing her ability to connect with people who were resistant to traditional social services. Their partnership had evolved from helper and recipient to colleagues working toward the same goals. You've become what I hoped you might become, Joseph told her one evening as they finished visiting several homeless camps around the city. Not just someone who recovered from a difficult situation, but someone who uses that experience to help others recover too. Sarah was also developing a romantic relationship with David, a nurse she had met during her hospital clinical rotations. He was aware of her history and admired her resilience and compassion. Their relationship developed slowly, built on friendship and mutual respect, rather than the desperate need that had characterized her brief marriage years earlier. I want to make sure I'm choosing this relationship from a place of strength, not from a place of fear of being alone, Sarah explained to Dr. Torres, who continued to provide occasional counseling sessions, even after Sarah's formal participation in the program had ended. That's very wise, Dr. Torres replied. The fact that you're thinking about your motivations that clearly suggests you're in a much healthier place emotionally than when we first met. As Sarah approached graduation from nursing school, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The woman who had lived in her car behind a gas station felt like someone from another lifetime. Yet Sarah carried that experience with her as a source of strength and perspective. I used to think my homelessness was the worst thing that ever happened to me, she told the audience at a community center fundraising event where she had been invited to speak. Now I understand that it was one of the most important things that ever happened to me. Not because suffering is good, but because surviving it showed me capabilities I didn't know I had, and connected me to a community I never would have found otherwise. The Apache tear that Joseph had shown her during their first conversation now sat on her dresser at home, a reminder of the wisdom she had gained about the relationship between strength and vulnerability, independence and community, giving and receiving help. 2 years after graduating from nursing school, Sarah stood in the same emergency department where she had once been brought as a patient during a particularly difficult night on the streets. But now she wore scrubs instead of dirty clothes, and her name badge identified her as Sarah Martinez, RN, Outreach Coordinator. The transformation still amazed her. Sometimes, her role at the hospital was unique. She split her time between providing direct patient care and coordinating services for homeless and at-risk patients. The position had been created specifically for her after hospital administrators recognized the value of having someone who could navigate both the medical system and the complex world of social services. From personal experience, Sarah, we have someone in bed 7 who's refusing treatment, called Dr. Peterson, the emergency department attending. Homeless gentleman came in with chest pain but won't let us run tests. Says he doesn't trust hospitals. Sarah nodded and made her way to bed 7, where she found a man in his 50s, sitting on the edge of the gurney, fully dressed and ready to leave despite the obvious distress he was experiencing. His clothes were dirty, his hair unkempt, and his eyes held the familiar wariness of someone who had learned not to trust institutions. Hi, Sarah said, pulling up a chair so she could sit at his eye level, rather than standing over him. I'm Sarah. I heard you're having some chest pain. I'm fine, he replied automatically. Just need to get out of here. Sarah studied his face, noting the perspiration despite the cool temperature of the room, the way he held his left arm. Can I ask what has you worried about staying? Is it the cost or something else? Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah learned that the man, Robert, had been hospitalized several years earlier and had been billed for thousands of dollars despite believing his care would be covered. The debt had contributed to his eventual homelessness, and he was terrified of accumulating more medical bills he couldn't pay. Sarah explained the hospital's charity care program and connected Robert with a financial counselor who could help him navigate insurance options. More importantly, she stayed with him during the procedures that revealed he was indeed having a heart attack, holding his hand as the cardiologist explained the need for emergency surgery. "You saved his life," Dr. Peterson told Sarah later. "He would have walked out of here and probably died within hours if you hadn't gotten through to him." Stories like Robert's had become routine in Sarah's work, but each one reminded her of her own journey and the power of having someone who understood speak on your behalf. She had developed a reputation throughout the hospital as someone who could connect with the patients others found difficult or challenging. Sarah's work extended beyond the hospital walls. She had become a regular speaker at conferences about homelessness and healthcare, sharing her perspective as someone who had experienced both sides of the system. Her presentations were powerful because they combined professional expertise with lived experience in ways that purely academic or policy-focused talks couldn't match. At one such conference in San Diego, Sarah met Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a researcher studying the effectiveness of peer support programs in healthcare settings. Dr. Rodriguez was impressed by Sarah's work and invited her to collaborate on a study documenting the outcomes of having formerly homeless individuals in patient advocate roles. "Your position represents a model that other hospitals should be implementing," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "Having people with lived experience in professional roles creates trust and improves outcomes in ways that traditional social work approaches often can't achieve." The research collaboration led to Sarah co-authoring several papers about trauma-informed care and peer support in medical settings. She found herself becoming an expert in her field, not just because of her education but because of her unique combination of professional training and personal experience. Joseph had continued to be a mentor and friend throughout Sarah's journey. Now in his 50s, he had been promoted to director of the community center and often invited Sarah to speak to new clients and volunteers. Their relationship had evolved into a true partnership, with Joseph frequently seeking Sarah's input on program development and policy issues. "You've become what we always hoped our program could produce," Joseph told her during one of their regular coffee meetings. "Not just someone who got back on her feet, but someone who's become a leader in addressing the issues that created your situation in the first place." Sarah had indeed become an advocate for systemic change. She served on the city's homelessness task force and regularly testified before the city council about the need for more affordable housing, better mental health services, and healthcare policies that didn't criminalize poverty. Her voice carried weight because she could speak from experience about what worked and what didn't. Her personal life had also flourished. She and David had married in a small ceremony at the community center, with Joseph officiating as a minister licensed by his tribal nation. Many of the guests were people Sarah had met during her journey from homelessness to stability: staff from the community center, former residents of the transitional housing facility, colleagues from the hospital, and patients she had helped over the years. "This is what community looks like," Joseph said during his ceremony remarks, "a gathering of people who have supported each other through difficulties and are here to celebrate each other's joys." Sarah and David had purchased a small house in a neighborhood near both the hospital and the community center. The house had a guest room that Sarah used to provide temporary housing for women transitioning out of homelessness, continuing her commitment to helping others navigate the path she had walked. One evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner, she received a call from Ruth at the transitional housing facility. A new resident, a woman named Jennifer, was struggling with the transition and had specifically asked to speak with Sarah. "She heard about you from someone at the clinic," Ruth explained. "She's in a situation very similar to what yours was. Lost everything caring for a sick family member, ended up homeless. Very proud and resistant to accepting help." Sarah drove to the facility that evening and found Jennifer sitting alone in the community room, staring out the window with the same defeated expression Sarah remembered wearing during her first weeks there. Jennifer was younger than Sarah had been, maybe 25, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who had been surviving on adrenaline and stubbornness for too long. Ruth said you wanted to talk to me, Sarah said, sitting down across from Jennifer. I heard you used to live in your car, Jennifer said without preamble. Is that true? Sarah nodded. For about 4 months. Behind a gas station most of the time. How did you know that accepting help was the right thing to do? How did you know you weren't just giving up? The question took Sarah back to her conversation with Joseph about Apache tears and the wisdom of accepting support. She found herself sharing not just the practical aspects of her recovery, but the emotional and spiritual journey of learning to see strength differently. I had to learn that there's a difference between giving up and choosing to fight your battles with allies, instead of fighting them alone, Sarah told Jennifer. Giving up would have been staying in that car until I died. Accepting help was choosing to live. They talked for 2 hours, and Sarah could see Jennifer's defensive walls beginning to crack in the same way hers had during that first conversation with Joseph. By the end of the evening, Jennifer had agreed to meet with Maria the next day and begin working on a recovery plan. Driving home that night, Sarah thought about the cycles of healing and helping that had defined her life since that morning when Joseph first approached her car. She had been rescued, and now she spent her days rescuing others. She had been seen and valued when she felt invisible, and now she worked to see and value people who felt forgotten. The Apache tear still sat on her dresser, but Sarah had added other meaningful objects to her collection over the years. Her nursing school graduation photo, her hospital ID badge from her first day as an RN, a thank you card from a patient whose life she had helped save, and a small framed picture of herself and David at their wedding, surrounded by the community that had supported them both. Sarah's story had become part of the larger story of the community center, told to new clients as proof that recovery and transformation were possible. But she knew that her story was still being written, that each person she helped and each life she touched added new chapters to a narrative that had begun with breakdown and had become a testament to the power of community, compassion, and the courage to accept help when it was offered. Standing in her kitchen, preparing dinner for her husband, living in a home she owned, working in a career that gave her life meaning, Sarah sometimes marveled at the distance she had traveled from that gas station parking lot. But she also knew that the woman who had lived in that car was still part of who she was. Not a shameful secret to be hidden, but a source of strength and wisdom that informed every aspect of her life as a healer, advocate, and human being who understood that none of us can make it alone. Working at the medical clinic felt like coming back to life in ways Sarah hadn't expected. The Sunset Medical Center was a small community health clinic that served primarily low-income patients, many of whom reminded Sarah of herself just months earlier. Her job involved checking patients in, updating insurance information, and helping navigate the often confusing healthcare system. Dr. Patricia Williams, the clinic director, was a family physician who had specifically requested to interview Sarah after learning about her nursing school background. We need people who understand what our patients are going through, she had said during the interview. Someone who's experienced hardship brings a different kind of compassion to this work. Sarah found herself naturally connecting with patients who seemed overwhelmed or frustrated by the system. She remembered the helplessness she had felt, trying to navigate her foster mother's cancer treatment, and she used that experience to help others understand their options and advocate for themselves. You have a gift for this, noted Jennifer, the head nurse, after watching Sarah spend extra time explaining a treatment plan to an elderly Spanish-speaking patient with the help of a translator. You make people feel seen and heard. The work was emotionally rewarding but also challenging. Being around medical professionals reminded Sarah constantly of her abandoned nursing career. She would watch the nurses and doctors going about their duties and feel a complex mix of longing and loss. These were the skills she had been developing, the career she had sacrificed to care for her foster mother. During her weekly sessions with Dr. Torres, Sarah began working through the grief she felt about her derailed plans. It's normal to mourn the life you thought you were going to have, the counselor explained. But grieving that loss doesn't mean you can't create a different kind of meaningful life. Joseph continued to check in with Sarah regularly, sometimes stopping by the clinic during his outreach rounds, other times meeting her for coffee after work. These conversations became an anchor point in her week, someone who had seen her at her lowest point and could witness her progress. I've been thinking about what you said about being a warrior, Sarah told him one afternoon as they sat outside a small cafe near the community center. "I used to think warriors were people who never needed help, who could handle anything on their own." Joseph smiled. "That's what I used to think too. But spending time with Apache elders taught me something different. In traditional Apache culture, warriors succeeded because they were part of a band, a community. They had specific roles, but they also relied on others for survival. The idea of the lone warrior is more from Hollywood than from real Apache tradition." He told her about his grandmother, who had been one of the last fluent speakers of Apache in their family. She used to say that the strongest warriors were the ones who could both give help and receive it. She said that refusing help when you needed it was actually a form of selfishness because it prevented others from fulfilling their purpose. This conversation shifted something fundamental in how Sarah viewed her recovery process. Instead of seeing her dependence on the community center's services as weakness or failure, she began to understand it as part of a reciprocal relationship. She was receiving help now, but she was also contributing through her work at the clinic, through her participation in house meetings at the transitional housing, and through the encouragement she offered to newer residents who reminded her of herself. One evening, Ruth asked Sarah to speak with a woman who had just arrived at the facility. Lisa was 35 years old and had been living in her car for 2 months after losing her job and apartment. She was angry, defensive, and convinced that accepting help was admitting defeat. "I don't need charity," Lisa insisted when Sarah sat down with her in the community room. "I just need to find a job and get back on my feet." Sarah recognized the words because she had said them herself just a few months earlier. Instead of arguing, she shared her own story, the pride that had kept her from seeking help sooner, the fear that had made her suspicious of kindness, and the gradual realization that accepting support was actually a form of strength. "I thought asking for help meant I was weak," Sarah said. "But what I learned is that staying isolated and struggling alone when help was available, that was the weak choice. The strong choice was admitting I couldn't do everything by myself." Lisa listened with the skeptical expression Sarah remembered wearing during her first conversations with Joseph. But Sarah could see something shifting in the other woman's eyes, the same crack in the defensive wall that Sarah had experienced. Working with newer residents became an informal part of Sarah's routine. Ruth began asking her to mentor people who were struggling with the transition from homelessness to housing, and Sarah found that helping others process their experiences also helped her continue processing her own. "You're becoming a bridge," Maria observed during one of their regular meetings. "You can connect with people in a way that those of us who haven't experienced homelessness can't." After 4 months at the clinic, Sarah received her first performance review. Dr. Williams praised her reliability, her patient interaction skills, and her initiative in identifying ways to improve patient services. Most importantly, she offered Sarah additional responsibilities and a small raise. "I'd also like to talk to you about something else," Dr. Williams said toward the end of their meeting. "I know about your nursing school background, and I want you to know that when you're ready to return to your education, this clinic would be very interested in supporting that goal." The possibility of returning to nursing school had been a distant dream for so long that Sarah had almost stopped believing it could happen. But Dr. Williams explained that the clinic had partnerships with local nursing programs and offered tuition assistance to employees who committed to working at the clinic after graduation. "It wouldn't be easy," Dr. Williams cautioned. "You'd be working part-time while going to school part-time, so it would take longer than a traditional program. But it's absolutely doable if it's what you want." That evening, Sarah called Joseph to share the news. His excitement and pride in her progress was evident in his voice. "This is exactly what I meant about being part of a community," he said. "People are invested in your success because you've shown that you're invested in it too." Sarah was also building relationships outside of the formal support system. She had become friends with several co-workers at the clinic, and she had started attending a book club at the local library. These normal social connections felt precious after months of isolation. But perhaps the most significant relationship she was developing was with herself. The person who looked back at her from mirrors now was recognizably the woman who had started nursing school years earlier, but with added depth and resilience. Her eyes had regained their brightness, but they also held wisdom that came from surviving something she had never imagined she would face. "I'm not the same person I was before I became homeless," she told Dr. Torres during one of their sessions. But I don't think I want to be. That person was naive about how quickly life could fall apart. This person knows how strong she really is. Dr. Torres nodded approvingly. That's what successful recovery looks like. Not returning to exactly who you were before, but integrating the experience into a new, more complete version of yourself. Sarah was also beginning to think about her transition out of the temporary housing facility. She had been saving money from her job and was close to having enough for a security deposit and first month's rent on a small apartment. The prospect was both exciting and terrifying. Exciting because it represented true independence, terrifying because it meant leaving the safety net that had supported her recovery. Transitioning to permanent housing is always a big step, Maria acknowledged when they began discussing timelines. But you're not going to be cut off from support. We maintain relationships with people long after they leave the program. As Sarah prepared for this next phase of her journey, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning when Joseph first approached her at the gas station. She had gone from invisible and forgotten to seen and valued. She had gone from surviving day to day to planning for a future that included meaningful work, education, and community.